Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Maya. I'm the Program Associate for Village Preservation. I'm so glad you're here with us this evening. I'm just going to say a little short bit about Village Preservation and then talk about it, then we can take it away for our speaker. Here at Village Preservation, we have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand, extend, and landmark zoning protections and stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We have secured landmark designation for more than 1,250 buildings in our neighborhoods and zoning protections for nearly 100 blocks. We host about 75 free programs a year, and our events cover a wide range of topics focused on the history, architecture, and culture of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo, and look at the important role of historic preservation in our communities and our lives. We look at the role of everything from local small businesses to independent cultural institutions, civil rights, social justice movements, great artists, writers, musicals, dancers, and others connected to the creative legacy of our neighborhoods, as well as the irreplaceable and unique built environment of our neighborhoods. We are a member-based organization, so your support is essential to enabling us to provide this free programming for our community and continue our advocacy and preservation work. If you like what we do, join or make a donation. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member. And I'm so delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. A.G. Norton has toured her slideshow about Berenice Abbott internationally. Norton has over 15 years of experience in London as a social worker and children's rights specialist, where she used her voice to publicly advocate for underserved, marginalized communities. Returning to New York in 2018, she discovered her family's personal connection and photographs of photographer Berenice Abbott, and has spent the last 3 years gathering research into Miss Abbott's remarkable life and artistic legacy. A.G. Norton has accessed 13 boxes of Miss Abbott's archives and interviewed Miss Abbott's friends, biographers Julia Van Haaften and Hank O'Neill. And please give it up for A.G. Norton.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. And thank you all for coming. Thank you all for joining together. There's something so special and magical about actually having an in-person programming experience. I know that we enjoy lots of things virtually, right? TED Talks, all of it. But there really is something so magical about being in a live space with people and friends. So again, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. So yes, I am A.G. Norton, or Amanda. You can call me Amanda. And I am a Berenice Abbott enthusiast and third generation student. But this talk, I've named it as, we're looking through the lens as Berenice is a friend, community member, teacher, and of course, artist. And she refers to herself as a downright eccentric, which is fabulous. Now, I am a social worker by trade. I was a social worker, still am. I work primarily with children and young people. But I also love storytelling, telling stories, hearing other people's stories. I think there's so much that we can learn about other people's stories. And I'm also, like I said, a third generation student of Berenice. So my grandfather, my father's father, was a student of Berenice at the new school, and it was a personal friend of hers. And I have inadvertently become and found myself as a performance artist. So I say that it's taken me 43 years to become a performance artist, but there you go. It has found me. Now, here are just some references that I like to give in terms of the things that I've done and the research I've done to bring you this material. Now, there's at least this is the third, possibly more, I don't know, but there was definitely the Berenice Abbott Greenwich Village by Luce Levine, which is available still on their website, and also the Greenwich Village Today and Yesterday lectures. And they're both really great lectures at giving you a sense of the trajectory of Miss Abbott's life and showing pictures that she took in the surrounding areas. And they're fabulous and they're wonderful. And this is not that show. I want to bring you something different, something that you wouldn't necessarily have been accessing through that. So this is much more of a personal storytelling. This is primarily my sources are the 13 boxes of Berenice Abbott's archives that are at the New York Public Library, which I've accessed twice. So I've gone through all of the 13 boxes on 2 occasions to be able to really try and understand the depth of the information that's there. And so many of the photos that you see tonight aren't available online. They are pictures that I have taken because I was able to actually access those, mostly letters, but some other personal effects. I have also been very graciously been given some time with the lovely Julia Van Haaften and Hank O'Neill, both who have written books on Berenice and knew her personally. And I've also visited several museums with her work. So back in 2012, when I was living in London, I was lucky enough to see one of her exhibits in Paris. I've also gone to the Tate Britain, where there's some work of hers that is in the conservation area that I've accessed, as well as the MoMA and the Met. Supplemental texts. All Night Party, The Women of the Bohemian Greenwich Village. It's a great read if you haven't already read it. And also The Baroness, The Dadaist. Her biography was also very helpful. And Lucia Joyce, also I read her biography, and Ulysses. Now, I have not read all of Ulysses, but I did have Ulysses playing on audio when I was first scanning 10,000 of my family's images. So the sound of Ulysses is really what colored so much of this journey. And I recently listened to A Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. So again, just sort of some of the texture that I've done in the research. But this is just one very small example. And these are mostly obviously just slide film, but I did find let me back up. My father's work was all and my grandfather's work was all in a basement in New Jersey. And when I returned to America in 2018, my mother said, "We're going to have to throw out all of your father and your grandfather's work. The basement keeps flooding and nobody's dealing with it." So, you know, I'm a Catholic, and guilt works as a motivator. Hi, come on in. And so I thought, right, okay, let me put all of these boxes of photos in my basement. So that's where they went and stayed for quite some time. And come, take a seat. We're only just beginning, so you haven't missed much. Don't worry. Come on in, friends. So I get all these boxes and I put them in my basement. And I go back to my life. And then the pandemic happens. And then I watch everything on Netflix that I possibly can. And then think, okay, right, I should go through what all of these photos that my grandfather and my father had left behind. So this is part of that storytelling and part of the journey that it led me on. And I really, you know, when I look to Berenice, she left me such a beautiful map. Now, my father died when I was 16, and my grandfather had Alzheimer's for most of my life. So I didn't have very strong relationships with these two men who I inherited all of their photos. But Berenice has been my teacher. So I'm going to talk you through some of the discoveries I've made in going through her work. And one discovery is there can be many chapters in an artist's life entitled Discovering Your Craft. Now, Berenice, for those who are unfamiliar, she was born in Ohio. She then has these 2 periods of time, sort of bookends of time in New York in her life. But in between those is a very fruitful time of hers in Paris. And so I love this. This is her in New York in a silent short film, smoking cigarettes and hanging out with the avant-garde. But of course, at this time, she's not a photographer, and she doesn't know necessarily that she's going to become a photographer. She just enjoys being in the village and being with the artists that are in the area. And she meets the Baroness Elsa von Freytag, who, I mean, you know, what a fabulous woman. And I'm so glad that you're familiar with her, because again, I do mention her in my other show, and sadly not many people know her, so I'm fabulous to see there's a good audience here for her. But, you know, I love her advice and sleep with everyone and be embarrassing, you know, words to live by. But she did have a very close bond and relationship with Berenice. This is a piece of work that was done by the Baroness called The Portrait of Berenice Abbott by the Baroness Elsa von Freytag. And I contacted the lovely people at the MoMA, and they very kindly made this piece available for me in the conservation area. And several conservationists were around with me and allowing me to sort of ask questions. But it's a really interesting piece, you know, and it's like made out of, you know, bingo chips and wig hair. I mean, it's not really, but it's made out of acrylic and glass and found objects, and really such an incredibly diverse piece that the Baroness had made in honor of her relationship with Berenice. And here, the accompanying paperwork that goes along to that work that's in their files is a little letter from Berenice saying, "There's a lens cap was in my hand and a small dog named Pinky." So that's that little item right there. But I just love that, and in honor of that very close relationship that the two shared. But Berenice, these are by Man Ray. And Berenice had met Man Ray first in New York, and she poses for him for several portraits here. And this, I just love this is of her very striking photo of her in her passport photo. But so she leaves New York around 1921, and she goes to Paris. Well, actually, she goes first to Berlin and is in Berlin studying sculpture for 2 years. And it's so fascinating, you know, she goes and she thinks she's going to be a sculptor, and she's schlepping the sculpting equipment to and from Paris and Berlin, and in one night by the side of the train abandons her sculptor dreams and abandons her sculptor equipment, which is such a crushing thing, I suspect, would have happened to a young artist who was so determined to think their craft and their art form was one thing, and then to have to abandon it would have been so very painful. And yet, she goes back to Paris and then strikes up a conversation with Man Ray. And Man Ray is looking for a new apprentice, and all of the male apprentices think they know everything, and she says, well, I don't know anything, and why not me? And so she becomes Man Ray's assistant. Now, I love to draw attention to her passport here. At the time, in the 20s, the assumption that the bearer of the passport is male. So it says, the bearer is accompanied by his wife and minor children. Which of course she has crossed out. But we, as a feminist, we have made some strides, thankfully, in the way that we issue passports. We still have some way to go. But she talks here in her notes about the reasons why she went to Europe and to escape the merry nets of conformity, which I just love that. Now, discovery number 2 that I found was artists thrive in community. Not exclusively, right, but often they do. And they're enriched at the intersection. So it's really this idea that Berenice goes to Paris and spends time with artists of so many shapes and sizes. So she's spending time with poets and with writers and with painters and with photographers and with dancers and with musicians. And it's the culmination of all of these influences. And she becomes after her time assisting Man Ray, she then, he says, you know, I'll assist you in learning actually how to get behind the camera, and she becomes a portrait photographer, and she goes on to have her own studio, and she begins to take many really crucial pictures of some incredible people during that time. Now, one of whom is this man, Eugene Auger. Now, Auger was interesting because he didn't really call himself a photographer at the time. He was a flaneur. He would walk the streets, and he would bring his very large 40-pound camera with him on these streets, cobble streets in Paris, and he would take images, and he referred to it as documents pour artistes. So what he was doing was using the form of photography and the paper being the document to which a painter or someone would be able to say, oh, I'm going to use this as inspiration. And so he took photos from a position of reality unadorned. And so you see here, he would go through Paris and capture some scenes of really aging Paris. But it's funny, when he said that when he was alive, the people who liked his photos were tourists from out of Paris and artists. Those were the people who could see the value of his work. And his client list included Matisse, Duchamp, Picasso, Degas, and Man Ray. Now, sadly, he dies shortly after that photo that Berenice she'd taken of him. And so she goes to deliver to him, realizes that he's passed away, and she says, well, what's happened to all of his work? There's all of this work that's been unsold. And so she finds out that it's at a Mr. Calmette's house. And she finds just out the address that he is living on, and she knocks on every door with a friend of that street to locate Mr. Calmette. And going through her letters, there are many, many letters from Mr. Calmette, of which they're all in French. So anybody who speaks really good French, reach out to me, because I'd love to know what they say. But she does enter into a dialogue with him and eventually obtains the photographs of Auger's work. And here I found a little press clipping. American girl finds photographer's plates showing French life. So she was probably a young woman at the time, but there you go. But she does, eventually she brings the photos of Auger's back to America and holds on to them for, probably about 30 or 40 years until they're eventually acquired by the museums to be able to say, yes, we recognize the value. But it's crazy in that I read recently that, a photograph that she couldn't sell, 70 years ago, it sold for over $600,000. Right? So it's just interesting how perspective in time changes people's idea of value. Discovery number 3, the reality of living at the jugular of the avant-garde. Now, I came across this sentence in her archives, and it was, Berenice, the people who are interested in your project don't have the money to support it, and the people who have the money aren't interested. Such is the life, right, of so many artists, is that you struggle for so many years. And I'm not even sure if this was in response to her trying to get the funding for the Changing New York series, or indeed her trying to get the funding to take the photos of the physics work that she went on to do later in life. Because both projects, she really struggled to be able to get the appropriate funding. So she was so far ahead of her time that it really took people with money and with sense, not just with money, to catch up with her, to be able to help assist her. And also that being an artist can be messy. So I put that in there, with Auger lugging a 40-pound camera as not a, towards the sunset of his life, right? He's carrying this. And Berenice living in the village with no hot water in her studio for 30 years. Crazy. But that is the dedication of an artist. So these photos are interesting because they're really the beginning of the Changing New York series. You may recognize these from the Met, if anybody was able to see. Yes, the Met exhibit. So this took these of that exhibit. But so she would go around with a short handheld camera and take snapshots of New York at different times of the day, at different lighting conditions, taking really meticulous notes. She was such an intentional photographer, and to her credit, her masterpieces show how intentional she was in really doing the research and finding the right time of day, the right angle to be able to get her exposures. Now, these are the photos I discovered that my grandfather had taken of Berenice while he was a student at the new school. I had never seen these before doing this project. So this is obviously Berenice is all the way to the right, and my grandpa, Charlie Norton, is taking the photo. And I don't know the names of the other three students that are in the photograph, but I love it. I love, and there was somebody sort of on, Facebook who was able to say what street that may have been taken on in the village. So afterwards, if you've got any insight into where exactly this would have been taken, but it would have been during the time that my grandfather was going to the new school. My father was born in 1942, so he wouldn't have been going to the classes much after 42 because he was busy being a dad. So I've put these around 1939, but I just love them. But I'd never seen them before doing this project. And here's another one, which I just love. Whatever eye contact is happening between Berenice and the other woman who's smoking a cigarette is intriguing. But I just love to see. I love to see the kind of the equipment, and really from that perspective you really get an idea of how much physical space it would have been taking up on the sidewalk. And another one, which is quite sweet. So here's some stuff about Berenice's approach to teaching that I wanted to share with you all. She says, after I lived in New York about 5 years, I taught one evening a week. I tell students that you have to learn the way a flower evolves. It is a seed, a nothing in the ground. It germinates and grows a little bit and boom, the whole plant. You grow gradually and maybe you learn something as you evolve. But by being forced and trying to pick it up from someone else, you cannot grow naturally for yourself. There are many teachers who would ruin you. Before you know it, you could be a pale copy of this teacher or that teacher. You have to evolve on your own. Which, as an educator myself, so I'm a social worker, but I also do after-school education for middle schoolers and high schoolers. So you guys are way better behaved by them, by the way. They're much more difficult. Nobody has a fidget in their hands. I'm very impressed. But it is. I have found many teachers throughout my life that have come in all shapes and sizes. And I really just enjoy her perspective that actually teaching is something where you're encouraging the evolution of oneself rather than instructing how to specifically do. And it had an impression. Her teaching had an impression. This is a beautiful letter that is written from a student, and I have to read it. It says, "Dear Miss Abbott, the article which I read in the New York Times the other day reminded me that I owe you a long delayed thank you letter. For some 40 years ago, when my then young husband had gone off to war, I took a course in photography that you gave at the New School in New York. You have no reason to remember, but I shall never forget. I did not become a professional, but you changed forever the way I saw the world, and I am profoundly grateful. I have wanted to tell you for so many years, and seeing this article gave me the opportunity. So I wish you a long life and health and contentment, and send you my thanks for the enhanced vision that has given me so much pleasure. Yours truly." And then it says, "P.S. I don't think my conservative mother ever got over the shock of seeing me stretched flat in Central Park, taking texture shots on the cobblestone pavement." Isn't that just fabulous? Isn't that fabulous? So that was written by a student of hers, a female student, in 1983, which is just so beautiful. And then this was, again, in one of her journals that I had gone through, or her diaries, and it just says, "Last class, fatigué." So, but just such a beautiful, to understand. Again, I don't know, from my grandfather, I have a few stories which I'll tell, but he passed, like I said, he passed away many, many years ago. So it's been a joy to be able to read the letters and find out a little bit more about what she was like as a teacher. Now, Discovery 4. In order to make art that is truly yours, suffering is an inescapable and essential part of the journey. And I say this because I don't know if people are familiar with the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. It's an international festival for performance art, and I went in this summer, and I performed my show 13 times in a row. And the 13th day, I woke up with face shingles. So there is a breaking point that you will find in everything you do, no matter how much you love it. But again, in terms of learning about Berenice's life, and that there were certain areas of suffering that she went through. Now, this is a fabulous article and transcribed from an interview that she had, and someone is asking her, well, haven't you found it an exciting experience being a photographer? And she replies, you can call it exciting if you want, when you have to shove trucks out of the way or are placed in dangerous positions so you can photograph a scene. So, she did have to do quite a lot as a young female photographer, as a young queer female photographer, to be able to establish her space. And so I'd love to kind of give that some acknowledgement. Now, this is a fun letter that I found. This is from St. Mark's Church in the Bowery from 1938. From the rector at the time. I understand that you have recently took some fine pictures of St. Mark's in the Bowery. And the Bowery here is spelled Bouwerie. I would fail that on any spelling test. But there you go. And I would like very much to see them, and probably to secure copies if that is possible. Also, it would be a pleasure to meet you and hear of your work. So I do hope that meeting happened. Of course, going through Berenice's letters, I only have seen, there are a few maybe draft letters that she wrote and held on to, but obviously primarily it's just the letters that she received. So I'm not sure if that meeting ever happened. But I didn't know that the Bowery had been spelt like that before. Did anybody else know that the Bowery? Oh, we got a few hands, so some people know. Does anybody know why it was called that? It's Dutch, yes. Again, thank you. I'm learning too as we go. But it's Dutch for farm, right? So can we imagine this having been any sort of farmland? I mean, it happened, but I mean, I'm asking, it's hard to imagine. It's hard for me to see it now when we look at how developed it is and how far we've come from it being connected to nature. So even just this little pocket of nature out here is like, oh, look, there's a little bit of air and trees. And so I say it to say that, the work that the Greenwich Village Preservation Society is doing is so very important, because keeping the village and keeping the history of the village and keeping that legacy on to younger generations is just so important. But of course, I've added for reference, the photos that she took of St. Mark's Church. Now, one of my favorite quotes that Berenice had said was that when she receives funding from the Federal Arts Project to be able to do the Changing New York series, and she has to go to the offices to deal with the gentlemen who manage the budgets. And one day, one guy says to her, well, nice girls don't go down past the Bowery. To which she replied, well, I'm not a nice girl, I'm a photographer. So I love this quote, and I have shared this quote literally around the world now at this point doing my performance, and it is one of the most beloved and most photographed quotes of Berenice's, because I think we sort of take it for granted, but we wouldn't have Cindy Sherman, we wouldn't have so many photographers, female photographers, queer female photographers, the way that we do if Berenice hadn't been such a trailblazer. And of course, that we were able to see these sort of street scenes that she took. Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm in your way. How was that? Fabulous. Yeah, so we know how the village has changed and evolved through her lens, which we're grateful for. Now this is also a very interesting photo, and it demonstrates the intentionality that Miss Abbott had in her photographs, because this photo was taken during the weekend, but the American flag was not usually hung outside on the weekend of the New York Stock Exchange. So she arranges for the flag to be there for this photo exactly. I think it's great. And I mean, who hasn't seen this photo, right? But unfortunately, I've seen this shared on Facebook, and it was liked 70,000 times, and no credit to Berenice. No, her name wasn't on there. So I'm happy to correct them. I'm happy to inform them. But again, it is one of the most iconic photos of a very special building that would have been torn down in the 1970s. Now, again, for your reference, if people aren't aware, that the exhibit that was on has closed of Berenice that was at the Met, but this interactive map still works. So if anybody is ever interested in going onto the Met's website, you are able to then see the pinpoints of where in Manhattan and Harlem that Berenice had taken photos, which I thought was kind of cool. It's a neat thing about technology. I mean, what a classic shot, right, of night view. Empire State Building, and she chooses, this is shortly after the Empire State Building is opened, and she chooses intentionally December 20th because she wants to, it's going to be a 15-minute exposure, and she wants to get the office building lights before, after 5 o'clock, people will start to turn the lights off. So she knows that she needs to capture it around 4:30 so that she's able to have the longest exposure possible. And this is me holding the negative to that image, which is quite remarkable. So yeah, I'm not wearing gloves, but it is in wrap, so don't worry, anybody from the library who might be here. But this is in the archives that I came across, and it was really remarkable. And it also just kind of gives you the scale of how big the negatives are to the 8x10 camera. I mean, you see how big the camera is, but I had never seen what the actual plates, what the film looks like. So that was kind of cool. Now, connected to that photo, this is a letter that Allen Ginsberg, another very famous villager, has written to Miss Abbott, and he's teaching in China. He's teaching poetry in China, and he's talking about how he's waking up from dreams about New York, and in his mind's eye, the New York he sees is the photos that Berenice had taken. And so he then also says, I learned a lot from the brief visit and want to thank you for your hospitality. And what I learned, mainly an old art life attitude, and then some specifics about panoramic perspective. This is, I don't see here, but I can find out. I may have cropped it out, or it may not have been. It may not have been on the letter itself. It may have been in the accompanying. So, yeah. No, thank you for the critique. Having a year would be helpful. But no, I love the fact that she makes such a beautiful connection with so many different people, and that she's clearly very memorable, and that her work, and he's asking if he can purchase some of her photos, which I just thought was really cool. So of course, she does go on to be able to have the Changing New York series published, which is really her kind of big seminal work. What is our discovery number 5? That legacies sometimes have to be fought for in order to be protected. And that there are several examples of this, which I will display. But this is the lovely Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, who were really they were the little review publishers They were the most dynamic, fabulous lesbian couple possibly the world has ever known. I don't know, I'm biased, but I adore them. And really, they were so responsible for helping to publish Ulysses in chapter form initially. This is what Margaret had to say about Ulysses, was that this is the most beautiful thing we'll ever have. We'll print it if it's the last effort of our lives. And Jane Heap refers to say, men think thoughts and have emotions about these things everywhere, but have rarely expressed it as delicately or imaginatively as Joyce's bloom. So, of course, now Ulysses causes some controversy and becomes banned from publication. And Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson are fined $100 and given a slap on the wrists for having published what is considered obscene. What's interesting about it, and Berenice's sort of relationship, is that she goes on to, she photographs James on multiple occasions. And this is the photo that he gets taken for when it. Pardon?
I just said I didn't know that she.
Oh, you didn't know she took it? Yeah. This is Berenice's.
It's a famous.
It's a very famous photo of Joyce, and this is the at least the second time that she has Joyce sit for him. Now the first time is at his apartment, and he's wearing a white coat, and he's wearing an eye patch, and she explains that she can't have any sort of light on him whatsoever because he's had such eye complaints. And so this is a sitting where she's now moved into her own and new studio where it's naturally lit by a sunlight. So with a sort of tip of the hat, he's able to be more comfortable in the way that he is photographed. And he had this photo, I've seen pictures of his apartments and different houses that he was in, and he had this photo displayed. So it was a treasure. It appears to be a treasure to him, but also of Lucia Joyce. There's several wonderful photos of Joyce's daughter, who was very interested and very talented in her modern dance form. I'm very happy to say that I have been invited by the James Joyce Centre in Dublin to come and speak at the Bloomsday Festival about Berenice. So I will be bringing this material and your comments and feedback to give them an even better version because this is, of course, a work in progress. So happy to talk afterwards. Now this is some of Berenice Abbott's commentary on that portrait, but she would say that she could only do one portrait a day. That to try and do anything more than that, she was like, I have to turn myself inside out to get these photos. And the other thing I forgot to say that she did with that Joyce photo was that she knew that he was kind of a little bit uncomfortable or awkward in front of the camera. So that time she pretends to start taking pictures until he gets sneaky. Then he gets comfortable, and then she really starts to expose film. But she says not all my portraits were done with studio lighting, and I had one place with good lighting in Paris where I did Joyce. His eyes were bad, and I couldn't have a single light on him, and that is where he wore his hat to shade his eyes. But she thought I thought he was a very elegant person. So it's lovely to hear that about the writer. Now, we can all cry over this for multiple reasons. I am from New Jersey, so I have to go through this station if I want to take any New Jersey transit, but not this actual station, right? But the modern version. So this is what Penn Station used to look like. For some audiences, they are unfamiliar. And it was an absolute, such a European flair to it, right? So gorgeous. And unfortunately, it was destroyed. And so it leads me to this very beautiful friendship that I had discovered. Now, I didn't know, and raise your hands if you did know, I didn't know that Jackie Onassis was a photographer.
Yeah.
right? I did not know that. So she was a photographer before she was the president's wife, a press photographer. And so she and Berenice develop a friendship. They meet in Paris at an Auger exhibition that, of course, Berenice had assisted in its arrangement. And so they developed this really beautiful friendship, which I just find so amusing and beautiful and funny, because at the time you think of Jackie being the kind of, like, she could be the, cat's meow, she could be around anybody that she wanted to, and I love that she and Barry or Berenice were friendly. And there was a handwritten letter from Jackie that I got to look through, and it says she is thanking her for having received the photo of Penn Station. She says, "Thank you so much. That was my favorite photo of Penn Station, and thank you as a gift." And she responds by making Berenice part of the Fruit of the Month Club, which I just think is so cute, right? Like, what a practical gift for Berenice is that she's going to get from Jacqueline Onassis. She's going to get fruit every month. But there is this, we obviously were aware that Jackie goes on to help save Grand Central Terminal. I go through it now that I live in Connecticut, and it is a testament to beautiful architecture, and it is probably I can't go in there and not have people taking photos of it, right? So what a treasure that it has been saved. But I do like to say that there perhaps was this little connection between Berenice and her love of Penn Station, and encouraging Jackie to take the torch on, because I'm sure it was not any small task. Now, Discovery 6, living intersectionally is political. Berenice did, as a queer woman, she, certainly from the stories that my grandfather said, that he would get invited for coffee. The students would all get invited for coffee after a lecture, and eventually coffee would turn into pints or drinks, and then the drinks would turn back up to Berenice's studio, and Elizabeth would eventually be the one who would say, "All right, everybody out." She would have enough. And my grandfather would have to schlep back through Port Authority and fall asleep on the bus back to New Jersey, and then have to walk back with his heavy camera equipment. And he would do the next week he would do the same thing. So the stories were clearly good enough and interesting. But the photo, and we'll come to it, of her holding my father. There was a little joke that my grandfather would say about it was like the Virgin Mary holding the Jesus. And when I was a child, I didn't quite get that joke. Now I understand, and as a queer woman, I don't necessarily think it's very funny, but there is an understanding that Berenice was, she allowed certain people in to her life. And so the people who were into her life knew that she had close relationships and sexual relationships with women. And the FBI were, investigating her at times for her lesbianism or potential communism, but she was a radical in every sense. And here are some of, again, the fascinating letters. She was a part of the National Organization for Women, so clearly she was a feminist. Now, this is interesting. This is a congressional record from, and I mean, it looks like it's signed by Bill Clinton, but I don't think the dates line up, so I don't know which bill it is, but it's saying the House of Representatives recently increased the additional funding for arts and humanitarian from 80 million to 145 million. And I thought you'd be interested in my remarks on this legislation. So she was very pioneering, and she wanted arts to be able to be funded and supported by our government, and she would develop relationships to support this idea. And here is a letter from Ronald Reagan. It looks like a telegram, and it's in recognition of the artistic gifts that she generously shared with countless numbers. And that Nancy and I happily join in the pride of your friends and colleagues to whom you've tremendous joy over the years. My best wishes. So there we go. But I mean, the letters just go on and on. There's letters from Lucia Joyce. There's a little card from Lily Tomlin and Jane Wagner. There's postcards from Allen Ginsberg, and also letters from Joe Hopper, which is really interesting. There's another one from the editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair, and what he's saying is he overheard a rumor that she was going to be writing a book about her time in Paris. And he begs her that if she's going to write a book about that time, that he get to be the first one to read it. Unfortunately, that book never appeared, but I love the fact that he wanted to be the first one to read it. And I just love this picture of Leadbelly. This is a photo that she sort of stops taking a lot of portraits in her time in New York, but interestingly takes this one. And this was a photo that I actually was able to see in person. So this is held at the Tate Britain over in the UK, and when I was there doing shows, I had arranged and was able to see it. So what I would say is that as much as it's lovely to look at these photos projected on this screen, that definitely take the opportunity to visit your museums, find where her work is in person, because it is a joy to behold and see a print in the flesh. Now, this is a very famous portrait of the painter Edward Hopper, and the famous stove that becomes a gift to Berenice when she's up in Maine. And there's a great letter that I found from so this is a letter written to Berenice from the person who was assisting the Hoppers towards the end of their life. And I'll just read you a quote. And she says, "In Jo's notes, she has references to you and the fine work you did on the photographs of Edward. I'm sure you know how difficult it was to please her and evoke praise from her." So I love that, again, this idea that Berenice was certainly not taken by any fools, and had a very strong sense of her own personal character, but that she was also very beloved. And Discovery 7, if there is a dance floor, dance. Life is for living. One of my favorite things that Berenice talks about in the really great one sort of video of her life, and she talks about she was there the first night that the name of the dancer is escaping me now. 1920s.
Josephine Baker.
Thank you, Josephine Baker. How could I forget that? But yeah, she was there when Josephine Baker first performed, and so I throw these in there because I think these are photos from an after party at the ICP. I could be wrong. They weren't exactly labeled, but I love Berenice on the dance floor, and I think this is possibly the daughter of Picasso, but I love her strutting her stuff. I love her clinking glasses, and she just had such a joie de vivre. She was really loved life, and I learned a lot from her. And I mean, again, that she's really been this map of how the legacies that I've received. Berenice and I have some similarities. Both of our fathers died when we were teenagers. We both lived in America and then lived in Europe for a good period of time. Both queer, and also both managing the legacies of somebody else's photography. So in my case, my father's, and for her, Eugene Auger. So she's been a beacon of insight, her bravery and conviction, and she was an individual. She felt deeply, and people felt deeply about her. Some people live their lives like as people, right? And some people go on to live lives where even meeting them becomes an experience. And Berenice was an experience. And talking to people who've had the pleasure to meet her, it was an experience. So here is her holding my father, which I just love. And I love this photo for so many reasons. The first being, I had that haircut when I was married to a woman. So she was an icon for me way before I even knew. And the denim jacket and the corduroy pants. right? So this is modern day Brooklyn of what, young people wear. So people, but this is 1943 because my dad was born in 1942. So I'm going to give it that he looks, about just over a year old maybe. But yeah, no, I do. I love this photo and the kind of bemused look on both of their faces, which is quite funny. But I am kind of coming up to my end. But I want to show you a few of the photos that so this is my grandfather, Charlie, and here are some of the photos that he took throughout his life. And I see how Berenice's idea of, you have 1,000 different angles with the same subject.
So forgive me, did he work professionally?
Oh, sorry, no, I'm glad you asked. He never worked professionally. He never had any of his work shown anywhere famous. He was he worked on engines all of his life and just took pictures and they were all in his darkroom. And so to me, it's a beautiful thing to show his work to audiences now because he didn't get to. And again, this idea that, I don't even know who this kid is. It's not even a family member. But I like the photo because it says something about the perspective of childhood, the way that he has kind of crouched down. And again, this idea that Berenice talks about, you have 1,000 different angles and the same subject. And it's the position that you take that says something about the way in which you view the world. And her eye and her queer perspective had a very lasting effect on how my grandfather took photos. And so these everyday moments, this is my great-grandmother and my brother, but it is a photo that I feel like speaks to something beautiful about an everyday breakfast. And my grandmother. I have to explain that my grandfather was a photographer for fun, and my father was also a photographer for fun. So this is another. My grandfather took pictures of people and places, and my father went to the Playboy Club. He took pictures all over the place. To be fair, but the other performance that I do, it's called Dad, Playboy and Me, not your average slideshow, and it is a feminist perspective of the Playboy Club and of the pictures of women in service. But it's a different. I've had people who have worked for Playboy come and see the show, and they said that they've seen thousands of photos by different photographers, and none are like my dad's. And I attribute Berenice Abbott to that. And I say Berenice was such a great teacher in how she captured the essence of a scene, of a place and people. And so that was passed to my grandfather, and then my father brought it to many places, one of which happened to have been the Playboy Club. So this is my ending quote here from Berenice, and it's where a view of the 20th century. So this is available on YouTube. It's a full film made by Martha Wheelock. It's fabulous. If you haven't watched it, please go and do. But she says the only pleasure you can get from creating something is the pleasure you have in doing it, not the final product even, and that cannot be taken away from you. It cannot be crushed. You have a certain kind of joy in creating it. And when I first watched that documentary and I first heard her say that, I had no idea what she was talking about. I didn't. I'll be honest, I had no idea. It kind of went over my head. I'm like, what is she talking about? Now, having been on this journey of being an artist or a performance artist or archivist or whatever I'm doing, I don't know, but I'm enjoying it. And that is the place of success that I find, is that actually coming to what a beautiful audience you have all been. So thank you so much for being such a wonderfully attentive and beautiful audience. But really it has been such a joy and a pleasure for me to go to different spaces and find out more and more about Berenice and to talk about her legacy and to engage with people about her work and her life. And so you are all a part of that. So thank you so much. I have been Amanda. You have been fabulous, and I'm going to be around. So if you wanted, I'm also happy to take questions if people wanted to take a question. Yeah.
Well, how did your father
father and grandfather connect with her?
Oh, my grandfather was a student at the new school.
Oh.
So yeah, so there were
Oh, she
photos.
taught there.
Correct,
I
yeah.
see.
So, sorry if I hadn't made that clear. The 3 photos that I'd shown were of Berenice teaching at the new school, and my grandfather was a student there. So that's how they met. And then they stayed in touch, and she came out to New Jersey and had a visit with my family at my grandfather's house where my father was, and that's how she ended up holding my dad. So yeah.
So she lived in Maine at the end of her life?
She did, yeah. She lived in Maine after her partner Elizabeth died when she was in the city. So she lived in Greenwich Village for about 30 years, and then after Elizabeth died, she moved up to Maine, but she was also working in Boston because she was doing the MIT work. So I mean, I doubt she commuted from Maine, but maybe she did. There may have been multiple residences. Yeah.
I was fascinated by the Edward Hopper exhibit at the Whitney.
Yeah.
At the same time that the Met was showing Berenice Abbott's photographs. And one of my takeaways was that she saw New York as it was transforming, going up this way.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to acknowledge that it was going up, but that it was going horizontal. And I just wonder if they knew, well, they did know each other because you indicated that they did. Was there a relationship that they had where they would, talk about their art in any way, or?
I mean, I would assume that they would. I mean, and there was a lot of correspondence between Berenice and Joe Hopper, so Edward's wife. There were multiple letters from Joe in Berenice's possessions, and also the stove, which is now back in the Hopper studio. But so they gifted her that up in Maine, that stove. So I would assume that they would have talked about art.
I just wondered about that as I was. I thought it was brilliant that they were both going on. The shows were both
at the same time.
At the same time, and they both spent a lot of time in Maine, and I just wondered about the.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, I have to say, I mean, maybe the New York Public Library might not love me for saying this, but it's not that hard to get into her. I mean, you just say you want to do it, and you follow the rules, and you book the time, and so by all means, I mean, we can all go. We could all do a class trip because there's anybody who speaks French, there's just so much to uncover still, and so much that's so fascinating, and it's hard to know even where to look or how to focus it. Yeah.
About maybe 20 to 25 years ago, I met Berenice Abbott. I heard her speak at Cooper Hewitt uptown.
Oh, right.
And she was talking about her life. And one of the folks asked her a question, and I always remembered her response, and I was a little surprised by that. The question was, had women helped her during her professional life during the 30s and 40s? And she said, no, absolutely not.
Yeah.
They weren't helpful at all. They worked against me. And I was surprised by that. And anyway, that's what I remember. But
No, I thank you. Well, hey, I mean, thank you for sharing that story, because I think it's great. It's not great to hear that, but I'm not surprised by that. Unfortunately, I think that there was so much competition, and that's kind of one of the challenges of the patriarchy, is that women then end up finding themselves kind of at odds and competing against one another, rather than actually trying to support and uplift one another. So it's unfortunate that she had that experience, but I'm unfortunately not surprised. Yeah.
Do you know how it is that her papers went to the New York Public Library?
I mean, I believe that's who she had agreed to kind of bequeath them to. I know she had a big exhibit of her work shortly before. That was kind of may have been her last big New York exhibit, the one that you guys had gone to. And I know that Julia Van Haaften, who was working at the New York Public Library at the time, she went on to, she's the author of her biography. So I would assume that there had been a relationship of thinking that they would be able to sustain and maintain, and do a good job to make sure, people are wearing their gloves or taking pictures the way that they should. I'm going to be around, but I am going to get some water now. But again, thank you all so very much.